Good afternoon. Hello. The human rights defenders and representatives from civil society, the members from the international community, dear participants, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this side event about human rights work in the Philippines, risks and challenges, organized by Franciscans International, AMP, Human Rights Watch, Forum Asia, OMCT, FIDH, International Service for Human Rights, Fasten Action, World Council of Churches, PAHRA, LILAK, CMSP, PhilRights, I Defend and Find. This is a hybrid event and it will be recorded. Please be reminded that no pictures are allowed to be taken except for the organizers. My name is Astrid Berenger. I'm the coordinator of the AMP, the German Action Network Human Rights Philippines, and I have the honor to be moderating this event today. Being a human rights defender in the Philippines is a dangerous and challenging undertaking. It requires a lot of dedication, passion for justice and equity, and courage, willingness to work over hours, constant optimism and hope. And it also comes with a lot of frustration, powerlessness, backlashes, and risks and threats to one's own life. Those who empower communities and support them to assert their human rights, those who criticize entrenched clientelism, environmental destruction by international mining companies, and injustices, large and small, are denounced as enemies of the state and become victims of harassment, criminalization, and forced disappearance, and even murder. The administration of former President Rodrigo Duterte demonized human rights in the Philippines, and he created the narrative of human rights as a terrorist idea, a narrative that continues to exist under the current government of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Since 2016, our network, the MP, has recorded 308 killings of human rights defenders, and since 2022 recorded the disappearance of 13 human rights defenders, 7 of whom are still missing. We also observed numerous cases of fabricated charges filed against human rights defenders and their organizations, more commonly on charges of terrorism financing. Perpetrators have not been held accountable, and up to now, the government has not acknowledged these human rights violations. Human rights defenders in the Philippines have to deal with a system of impunity, a judicial system that is dysfunctional and not accessible for the most marginalized people, and a government that opens up its country's doors to foreign investment without considering implications for human rights. That's why the access to international human rights mechanisms and institutions have become even more important to human rights defenders in the Philippines. The arrest and detention last year, and hopefully soon starting trial against Rodrigo Duterte on charges of crimes against humanity before the International Criminal Court, is a huge victory for the victims and the families of Duterte's so-called war on drugs that took the lives of at least 27,000 people. But also the human rights defenders and supporting organizations who consistently encourage victims to submit information to the ICC, to speak up and fight. They have played an important role for bringing Duterte to The Hague. Against the backdrop of the latest and last report to the Human Rights Council by Mary Lawlor, the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders, who is also present here today, in which she directly asked human rights defenders about the challenges they face in their work. This side event will focus on 3 issues: the threats Indigenous environmental human rights defenders are facing, challenging extractive projects, the weaponization of law and criminalization of human rights defenders, and challenges human rights defenders are confronted with in pursuing justice in a system deeply shaped by impunity and weak rule of law. I will now introduce 3 speakers from the Philippines, and our guest of honor here on the panel, Special Rapporteur Mary Lawlor. I will then pose a question to each speaker and invite Mary to provide us her assessment on the challenges of human rights defenders in the Philippines. After the presentations, I will open the floor for questions. Our first speaker is Rachel Tahay. She could not be here present, unfortunately, because she couldn't travel because of the developments in the Middle East. Rachel but she is here online. She's a Tiduray woman and currently serves as the Secretary General of the Tiduray Women's Organization, Ingat Fintaylan, Fintailan, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a partner organization of LILAK, Purple Action for Indigenous Women's Rights. Her community is located within the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. She's one of the most active human rights documenters among Indigenous communities and also an active Indigenous woman community journalist. And then on my right is Vincent Oville. He's the Research and Documentation Officer of the Philippine Human Rights Information Center, PhilRights, based in Manila. He's the lead person in the organization of the monitoring and documentation of human rights violations. PhilRights is a research and information arm of the Philippine Alliance of Human Rights Advocates, PAHRA. PhilRights currently conducts monitoring and documentation of cases of human rights violation in the so-called war on drugs. And then we have also online Samantha David. She unfortunately could also not travel like Rachel. She is the Project and Development Management Officer of PAHRA. She coordinates with alliances networks to design and implement initiatives that respond to the human rights situation in the Philippines. And then on my left is Mary Lawlor. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders. Next month, Mary will be ending her mandate that she's been holding for 6 years. She has also founded Frontline Defenders in 2001 to focus on human rights defenders at risk. And she has worked with human rights defenders for over 20 years and has been engaged with human rights defenders and human rights work for double that. I'm very grateful for her great commitment and support for human rights defenders in the Philippines. And now I would like to pose my first question that goes to Rachel. So Rachel, especially since the establishment of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao or BARM in 2019, the non-more indigenous peoples, a minority group in BARM that you belong to, have been experiencing discrimination, criminalization, violence, and further marginalization. Can you tell us more about what it means to live as a NMIP, a woman human rights defender in BARM, asserting your rights? And why is your community experiencing these human rights violations? Please.
Yes, greeting to everyone. And thank you for this opportunity to speak in solidarity with Indigenous peoples around the world who continue to face violation and their rights. My name is Rachel Tahay, Etadora Indigenous Women. I speak on behalf of the non-Moro Indigenous people in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. I also present Inged Fintailan and LILAK, Purple Action for Indigenous Women. The NMIP in BARM have long experienced marginalization and discrimination in our ancestral lands. While the passing of Bangsamoro Organic Law in 2018 was celebrated as milestone in peace-building effort in Mindanao, it did not guarantee the recognition and respect of our rights. Under the Bangsamoro Transition Authority, the interim government of BARM, NMIPs continue face systematic discrimination. As NMIP, we encounter multiple and intersecting challenges, including the non-implementation of Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act in BARM. The issuance of BTA Resolution Number 38, which issue a cease and desist order to National Commission on Indigenous Peoples, intervention in processing our ancestral domain claim. The threat proposed mining operation with our lands and the continued non-passage of a genuine NMIP code, which reinforce our lack of participation in decision-making processes. These factors have led to land grabbing, killing of NMIP, and the terrorizing of communities. Threat, surveillance, and harassment against community leaders are also increasing. According to our documentation, 102 Tedoray and Lambangian have been killed in Barm since 2018. Indigenous women are severely impacted by these compounding issues. Sorry, I'm left that tend to communities while continuing to face threat in the course of their monitoring and documentation work. I also documented the broader form to violence and experienced by women and by the Teduray and Lambangian communities. Despite of our work, we sometimes face threat, red tagging, and harassment along with other leaders. This is deeply concerning. Sorry. This is deeply concerning as many of our peers have been suddenly arrested or killed without sufficient evidence. We continue to speak out to protect our rights, even as destructive projects impose upon our ancestral land, such as mining operation, plantation, and irrigation system implemented without proper consultation or consent. As a leader, I cannot give up even knowing that defending our rights and can cost live because we fight the right to live in peace and dignity. Mining for various minerals such as gold, copper, carbon, and zinc is often presented as a solution to the global climate crisis. Yet this project severely affect our ancestral land, destroying farms, fisheries, and drinking water, and causing extreme hardship for indigenous farmers. This also results in youth losing interest in education, leading many into early marriage in the hope of escaping poverty. Many many are subjected to sexual abuse, with with some raped by employers who force them into work, and in other cases, the perpetrator are foreign worker employed by many companies. We stress the responsibility and accountability of the international community in urging the Philippines government to pay attention to this alarming situation. We ask the Council to urge the Philippine government ensure the protection of NMIP, especially community leaders, women and right defenders, and those facing threats, harassment, and surveillance and to establish effective protection mechanism. Conducting prompt and independent investigation into human rights violation in Burma and ensure that all perpetrators are held accountable. Respect and uphold indigenous people rights, including ancestral domain recognition and self-determination. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, for this very moving speech. It's terrible to hear what is happening to your community. I really appreciate your courage to speak here. And I do hope the international community members here have paid attention to your calls. My next question will go to Vincent. So, Vince, the ICC's indictment of Rodrigo Duterte has brought the victims of the so-called war on drugs and their relatives a step closer towards justice. However, prosecuting those responsible for the thousands of extrajudicial killings through the national justice system is an enormous challenge. Can you explain why it is so difficult for human rights defenders to access justice in the Philippines?
Excellencies, distinguished delegates, representatives of civil society, and members of the international community, good day. If the law can be bent by those in power, punishment will always fall on the powerless. This is the essence of impunity, and it continues to haunt the Philippines nearly a decade after the declaration of a nationwide so-called war on drugs. Justice remains elusive. Thousands of lives were lost. Families were shattered. Communities were tormented. Yet, instead of accountability, we confront manufactured legal debates, distorted claims of violated sovereignty, and sustained campaigns of misinformation aimed at undermining international justice. Most alarming is not only the distortion of law, but the erasure of victims, their suffering reduced to political inconvenience. This disregard did not end with a change in administration. Under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., prolonged inaction has deepened the stagnation of justice. Rather than affirming the state's obligation to victims, accountability has been treated as optional, transactional, or as a weapon in internal political struggles. The United Nations Joint Program concluded in 2024 with commitments from the government to strengthen investigation, prosecution, and monitoring of human rights violations. Yet, these promises remain largely unmet. To date, only 5 convictions have been secured out of the thousands of killings linked to the so-called drug war. Families of victims continue to face serious barriers in accessing domestic remedies. Critical evidence, including police reports, remains difficult to obtain. Those who attempt to pursue cases are subjected to intimidation, harassment, and threats. Institutions tasked with prosecuting perpetrators prioritize only easily winnable cases, leaving thousands unresolved. The culture of impunity therefore persists. Against this backdrop, the arrest of former President Rodrigo Duterte marked a significant development. On March 11, 2025, acting through Interpol on behalf of the International Criminal Court, authorities executed a warrant of arrest upon his arrival in Manila. The ICC's pre-trial chamber found reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, and rape, were committed during the period when the Philippines was a state party to the Rome Statute from November 2011 to March 2019. In response, coordinated disinformation efforts have sought to delegitimize the court and confuse the public. False claims of kidnapping, allegations of sovereignty violations, manipulated images, and fabricated celebrity endorsements have circulated widely, exploiting digital platforms to weaken trust in international accountability mechanisms. Despite attempts by the defense to delay proceedings, Confirmation of charges hearings were recently held at the ICC. We remain hopeful that the charges will be confirmed so that trial may proceed. For many victims, the ICC represents not interference but a necessary alternative to a domestic justice system that has failed them. Crimes against humanity demand more than rhetoric. They require sustained cooperation, political courage, and an unwavering commitment to victims. We call on the international community to defend the independence of the International Criminal Court and to support calls for the Philippines to rejoin the ICC. We urge stronger reforms within our domestic justice system. We call for collective efforts to counter disinformation with truth and to protect victims and witnesses from retaliation. We ask donor institutions to increase, not reduce, support for victims and community-based documentation initiatives. And we call on civil society across borders to continue amplifying survivors' voices amid escalating attacks against human rights defenders. Let this not be remembered as a fleeting moment, but as a turning point. Stand with the victims, defend the truth, uphold international law, and ensure that crimes against humanity are met not with silence or delay, but with justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince, for your powerful words. They underline the frustration of pursuing accountability in a judicial system that is truly dysfunctional, and it reminds us once again of the importance of access to international justice and human rights mechanisms. My next question goes to Samantha. She's also online. So Samantha, criminalization has been a common means of repression of human rights defenders in the Philippines. Could you tell us more about which laws are used to attack human rights defenders, who assert their rights, and how they are used?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the discussion. In the Philippines, human rights defenders continue to carry out their work, even under continuous threat. HRDs defend land and the environment, labor rights, press freedom, ancestral domains, and democratic space. They document violations, facilitate support for families of extrajudicial killing victims, and act for the protection of human rights. And yet authorities increasingly use the law to silence human rights defenders instead of protecting them as rights holders. Across the country, corruption, development aggression, and displacement persist. In Luzon, the Sumalo farmers of Bataan resist the conversion of their agricultural land into commercial space. But in response, they face multiple criminal charges that function as strategic lawsuits against public participation or SLAPs to drain community resources and attempt to undermine collective resistance through legal intimidation. Meanwhile, in Visayas, labor leaders were charged under the Public Assembly Act following a peaceful protest against corruption in government infrastructure projects. During this protest, protesters symbolically threw tomatoes at the Department of Public Works and Highways logo to express public frustration over corruption and the lack of accountability. However, despite the peaceful nature of the assembly, authorities later accused protesters of carrying offensive weapons, referring to the tomatoes. In Mindanao, the Manobo Pulangion in Bukidnon has been displaced from their as ancestral land for generations and forced to live in precarious conditions along the roadside while private entities occupy their land. Despite legal recognition of their ancestral claim, they continue to face intimidation, red tagging, and violent repression when asserting their rights to return to their land. The criminalization of protest is a recurring reality in the Philippines. Just last week, during the mobilization marking the 40th anniversary of the People Power Revolution, police officers arbitrarily arrested human rights defender Edel Parducho, who is also from PAHRA, and youth activist Tri Odenia. I was personally present during this mobilization and witnessed the events leading to the arrest. Police repeatedly pushed protesters to the side of the road, accusing us of causing traffic and public disturbance. As tensions arose, Edel and several others positioned themselves defensively between the police and the crowd. Yet instead of de-escalating, officers suddenly dragged Edel by the collar, forced him to the ground, and handcuffed him while he remained in a defensive posture. After a while, Triodenia, who had been documenting the mobilization through photographs, was also pulled by her hair and arrested. Authorities later filed charges of direct assault, resistance to authority, illegal assembly, and physical injury against them, where these allegations are contradicted by video documentation and eyewitness accounts. This case reflects a broader pattern in which peaceful assemblies are met with force and defenders are subject to arrest and prosecution simply for exercising their rights. We assert that the state has a duty to facilitate public assemblies and not to suppress them, but excessive police force during protests continues and officers resort to unnecessary and disproportionate violence. Laws such as the Anti-Terrorism Act have also been used to file fabricated charges against activists and development workers, including allegations of terrorist financing. These cases carry enormous stigma and risk, and while some are eventually dismissed by courts, the process itself already punishes defenders, especially in the Philippines, where the legal system is very flawed and unfair. HRDs endure arrest, prolonged legal proceedings, reputational damage, and psychological strain. And organizations are forced to divert limited resources from communities to legal defense. So even when charges are dropped, the injustice has already occurred. Criminalization of dissent continues, with many political prisoners, such as Sally Ohano, still detained for their activism and community work. Until today, red tagging also continues to endanger lives despite the Supreme Court ruling that recognizes it as a threat to life, liberty, and security. And despite these risks, the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, continues to operate. Under the Marcos administration, enforced disappearances have also increased, particularly targeting land and environmental defenders. Some cases have seen limited legal remedies, such as the writ of amparo being granted in the cases of Bazu, De Jesus, and Dexter, and both habeas data and amparo in the cases of Felix Salaverria and James Asmines. These rulings formally recognized that authorities, particularly the police, did not exercise extraordinary diligence in investigating the cases. But even with these developments, there has been little to no follow-through or tangible protection. These laws create the appearance of progress and offers hope, yet the lack of implementation still leaves justice out of reach. Until now, the Philippines has also not ratified the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance. We also still lack a comprehensive framework to protect human rights defenders, such as the Human Rights Defenders Protection Bill, which has languished for years, and the Commission on Human Rights Charter, which would expand the CHR's protective mandate, but still has to be enacted. We see that the Philippine legal system continues to operate with a glass ceiling, seemingly offering avenues for accountability, but rarely delivering actual justice or meaningful protection. We've seen how protective measures remain stalled while restrictive laws remain operational, and how perpetrators manipulate legal technicalities to reverse justice. They portray activists as nuisances and reduce protests to traffic obstruction or public disturbance, and shift attention away from calls for accountability onto alleged procedural violations, especially in terms of securing permits for public assemblies. These criminalizations continue to undermine human rights and cannot be tolerated. We ask the international community to call on the Philippine government to drop fabricated charges and release political prisoners, peacefully defending rights, to immediately pass the Human Rights Defector Protection Bill, ratify the International Convention for the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Surveillance, and strengthen the Commission on Human Rights through the passage of its charter, and also to end red tagging, abolish the NTFL-CAC, and amend restrictive laws such as the Public Assembly Act to align with international human rights obligations. Human rights defenders must be protected, not criminalized, so we can continue our work. And we call on your support to also remain vigilant and to support the protection of HRDs to ensure that the Philippines fulfills its national and international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you, Samantha, for your testimony. As Vincent has elaborated, accessing justice at the national level remains elusive for the most marginalized people and human rights defenders. It's highly alarming to hear how laws are deliberately used against human rights defenders. A state should not persecute its own people. And now I'd like last to invite Mary to reflect on the testimonies of our speakers from the Philippines and provide an assessment on the situation of human rights defenders. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you for having me here. I want to thank the other panelists, Vincent and Samantha, sorry, a senior moment. Samantha, and particularly Rachel, who shows such courageous commitment in our work at clearly deep personal cost. So thank you very much for allowing me to be here and to listen to you. The Philippines is one of the most dangerous countries in the world to defend and promote human rights. Just after I took up the mandate, the scale of the challenge was laid out in a report by the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. It included information on the killing of 208 human rights defenders, journalists, and trade unionists between January 2015 and December 2019, 30 of whom were women human rights defenders. And those killings overlapped with former President Rodrigo Duterte's so-called war on drugs, during which, according to the most conservative sources, 8,663 people were killed. The period was also marked by the development of a web of repressive legislation enacted in the name of combating terrorism, which had huge implications for human rights and human rights defenders, and continues to have today. In the first year of my mandate, 2020, the killings just kept coming. Jose Ronaldo Porquia in April, Carlito Badion in May, Zara Alvarez in August, and then there were more. And in 2021, it was the same, with the Bloody Sunday raids of the 7th of March 2021, leaving 9 activists dead as Duterte ordered security forces to forget about human rights. The presidency of Bongbong Marcos, beginning in June 22, has seen no let-up in the violence and attacks. Killings of human rights defenders in the Philippines often follow a pattern of escalating risk. They begin with smear and defamation campaigns fueled by hate speech, often coming from high-ranking officials in the government or military, which undermine and delegitimize the entire human rights project and the act of defending it. And as those campaigns grow, human rights defenders become more exposed to an ever more serious degree. And the examples of this are widespread. The government debates them, but they have no evidence to stand on. This is not a phenomenon unique to the Philippines, but the country shows an example of it at its most unrelenting. As in other places, Indigenous peoples, as we've heard, are caught in the eye of the storm, with Indigenous leaders and human rights defenders directly targeted. This too has been the case for some time, despite the High Commissioner's report despite as the High Commissioner's report put it back in 2020, the legal framework for the rights of Indigenous people in the Philippines remaining exemplary on paper. That kind of disconnect between good laws and terrible practice is not uncommon, and it raises serious questions relevant to the Philippines and beyond. Good laws protecting human rights are usually the fruit of long struggles by communities, human rights defenders, and civil society. Once they are enacted, why are they not having the positive effect they seem to provide for? How could what is laid out on paper be actually put into practice? Indigenous communities and human rights defenders in the Philippines live in areas that are resource-rich and considered by dominant actors at home and internationally, including companies and local and national authorities, as ripe for development. Rarely does this so-called development take into account the human rights or needs of people living in these areas, nor does it abide by the UN principles, guiding principles on business and human rights. In many cases, that is not even conceived in the model. The dominant form of what is called development in our world is focused on the exploitation of natural resources. The extractivism is defended from different angles and ideological causes and bases, sometimes branded as sustainable and sometimes not, but it is rarely challenged in any of its forms. Human rights defenders are the exception. They challenge it, in particular, Indigenous human rights defenders who insist on the right to have a say in projects that are affecting them and their territories, including the right to say no. They recall the human rights treaties that the Philippines and other governments have signed up to and protest, demanding that they be put into practice. They refuse the dominant paradigm in which profit, exports, and investment trump the protection of the environment. They are looking for alternatives, and so they are targeted. It is done because they are getting in the way, and there are people who want to clear the path for themselves, who want to push their project through or hold on to power. And all this happens in the context of historical, systemic discrimination against Indigenous communities, which Indigenous defenders have to struggle with when trying to make their voices heard. Within that context, Indigenous women face even more and even greater difficulties with gender-based discrimination inside and outside their own communities, intersecting with the discrimination they already face based on ethnicity. I'm coming to the end of my mandate now, and I will be thinking of those human rights defenders killed in countries like the Philippines, and those who have been disappeared. And I'll be thinking of the family members and those still searching for loved ones and seeking justice. In order for the killings of human rights defenders to stop, we need to radically change the drivers of our economies, societies, and politics. We need to move beyond the current economic model and place human rights, the environment, and people at the heart of decision-making. If we don't, the violence is going to intensify as the problems of the current system has created a spiral. We all need to realize this and try and do what we can to work for real change. And that's what human rights defenders are doing in the Philippines, and they deserve all the support we can offer, and we must do all we can to give it to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, for your empowering words. I myself have been in touch with your team several times in the past years, and I'd like to thank you for your relentless efforts to supporting human rights defenders in the Philippines. And now I'd like to give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. We have roughly 8 minutes before we close up, so maybe 1 or 2 questions would be okay. Please introduce yourself before you speak and keep your question brief. Thank you.
Well, good morning. My name is Mohammed Serkal. I'm the director of Solidarity Advocacy Campaign. We also focus on minority in general and indigenous people. I'm also the former advisor to the UN in Iraq on minority. And is really a pleasure and honor to be be attending Mary, speaking, especially she's the founder of Frontline Foundation. And we all know how deep she was active in her human rights defending, especially in Middle East and the Gulf. My question is, when we come to campaign for the human rights defenders and indigenous and minority, of course, when it comes to human rights defenders, the main target is the minority and indigenous people, because those are the first people who has encounter violation of the human rights. What other mechanism, Mary or others of the audience, that the UN can provide to combine the human rights defenders, indigenous people, and minority rights together? So in a campaign to defend them, they are minority and indigenous people at the same time, and the human rights defenders, because now we see different mechanism, human rights defenders, experts, indigenous people experts, minority experts. How can we combine them together so we can put them as like the one mechanism? I don't know, I'm asking for the future. Thank you so much.
So, Mary, maybe you want to go first?
I suppose what I would say first is, obviously you all have to talk to each other, and you have to develop a common strategy on how to work together and what you want. And it should obviously be something, it should be a shared and common vision and goal. And then you need to put in place the elements that you need to make progress towards that goal. And nobody can do that for you. You have to do that for yourself. Because if you don't have your platform that you are agreed on, that will strengthen your individual efforts as a collective of minorities of one kind or another, then you'll always be, in my view anyway, the discrimination is it's just so hard to get over. But part of it, I would say, is looking at the laws to protect human rights defenders. And I know ISHR have developed a model protection law, which we have it on our website, which you could use as a basis for discussion among all of you to lobby for, so that at least you would have something you could point to. And then, of course, there are protection networks, and the protection networks need to be specific. So if you are talking about, bringing people together with a common aim, it can't be a what you're looking for can't be a one-size-fits-all. But there are a few broad principles that would apply to any protection network. So the first thing is it has to be developed with human rights defenders. So in your case, you would have to go to the communities that you want to partner with to become stronger and see what it is that those people, all of you, think is important in a protection network. And it should be gendered. and it should cater for particular circumstances, for women human rights defenders, for example, for minorities, for LGBTI. You can't pick and choose who you want to defend. If you're a human rights defender and you're defending the rights of others, you have to defend all rights, regardless of what they are or where they are. Indigenous defenders, of course, because so often Indigenous defenders are left out of participative decision-making when it comes to the issues that affect them and their land and territories in their struggle to make the world a better place, both environmentally and in terms of climate change. And then I suppose you have to be very insistent that nobody who has come, if you get the physical protection, it has to be provided by independent people. It should not be provided by the same police or military forces that have been responsible for the risks in the first place, which we've seen in some countries. So, I mean, that, in my view, is the way to strengthen and build a campaign. I don't know whether it's of any value.
Thank you, Mary. Is there another question in the room that would be very brief? Or would any of the other participants like to give an input? Otherwise, I will be closing.
May I say something then, if nobody else is going to say something? Before I was in the mandate, I was the director of Frontline Defenders. I remember going to the EU Commission about the killings in the Philippines, which we had tracked. And at that time, I can't remember the year, but at that time, it was they actually didn't know. And, you know, they were very surprised and shocked to hear from us the information that we were giving them about killings, to such an extent that they called a meeting, you know, about the Philippines and the killings in the Philippines. So make sure always, I should have said this, try and get your target specific. You know, whoever you are trying to get to take action, get as close to that target as you can. Don't just leave it very broad and very, you know, hopeful. I mean, you have to leave it hopeful, but, you know, don't think, I should say, that it'll automatically reach the right target. You have to always try and find who it is you're trying to influence, why it is you're trying to influence them, and also how do you influence them. You know, it isn't, nowadays, human rights work it needs to be very targeted and specific.
All right. Thank you, Mary. So I will be closing this event now. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Special thanks to our panelists here and in the Philippines. In particular, Rachel, for sharing a very moving and very personal testimony. Thank you very much, Mary, for speaking at our event during your last Human Rights Council session. We are very honored. And what has been clear today is that the human rights situation in the Philippines remains dire. And there is a very strong continuous call for accountability for human rights violations. Human rights defenders are facing multiple challenges and crises, and they need more support and strong protection. And to realize that it also needs further actions from the international community and the Human Rights Council members. Thank you very much. And if you want to, we are available outside of the room for continuous discussions. Goodbye.